33. I dated an English girl before my Amish baptism. My father chose my wife the next week. Her name was Hannah. She drove a blue Ford with a dent above the back wheel, and the first time I sat in the passenger seat, my hands smelled like the chamomile I'd been cutting all afternoon for Mam's tea. I was 20. Almost baptized. Almost a man, by our way of counting. She had a laugh that didn't ask permission. I remember thinking, no. Wait. The first thing I remember is the radio. She turned it down when I got in, like she already knew. Like somebody had told her our ears weren't used to it. We met 3 times. Only 3. Once by the feed store, once at the diner off Route 30, where I drank black coffee and couldn't taste it, and once by the creek, where my grandfather used to pull golden seal root in October, kneeling in the cold mud with his bare hands. That third night, I came home, and the kerosene lamp was still burning in the kitchen. Dad was sitting at the table. He didn't look up. He just said, plain, Joseph, sit. I sat. He said, I spoke with Aaron Stoltzfus today, about his Rebecca. That was Tuesday. By the next Tuesday I was promised. I was 20 years old, and a girl I'd kissed once was already a ghost. Quick pause. My name is Joseph, and this is P-Suff. If these stories stay with you, if they remind you of something the old ones knew, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, did your father ever choose something for you that you couldn't choose for yourself? And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these old ways are worth remembering. That keeps this going. Now, back to what happened. In our community, a son doesn't pick his wife the way the English do. He doesn't, and he didn't, and for a long time he wasn't supposed to want to. The fathers watched. The mothers whispered over the wash line. The bishop knew which families had daughters of age and which had sons who hadn't knelt yet. It was a quiet machine, and it ran on what nobody said out loud. Dad used to say it plain. A good match is built before the heart gets loud. I didn't understand that sentence until I was past 30. I thought it was about obedience. It wasn't. It was about the chamomile, the comfrey, the way 2 families' remedies have to mix in the same kitchen for 50 years without poisoning the children. That's what the old ones knew. Marriage in our world wasn't romance. It was medicine. Slow, daily, root-deep medicine. Nobody sat me down and taught me this. I watched it. I watched Mam grind dried mullein leaves into a jar that came from her mother's mother, and I watched Dat carry that jar to Aaron Stoltzfus's house one winter when the Stoltzfus boy couldn't breathe. I watched the trade, our mullein for their plantain salve, and I watched 2 fathers nod at each other over a kitchen table without smiling. That's how alliances were made. That's how cures stayed alive. A girl from another farm wasn't just a wife. She was a recipe. She was the keeper of what her grandmother knew about fevers, about birthing, about the bleeding that wouldn't stop. I almost asked Dad once, when I was 16, why we didn't just marry who we wanted. I didn't. The question dried up in my mouth like a leaf in August. Hannah didn't know any of that. How could she? She thought I was just a quiet boy in a black hat who liked the way she laughed. And maybe, for 3 nights, I was. But the morning after that creek, I stood in our barn with the second beam Dad had to brace after the storm of '94, and I pressed my forehead against the wood until it hurt. I knew before he said her name. There's a thing that happens in a plain house when a decision has already been made above your head. The air goes still. Mam wouldn't look at me at breakfast. My younger brother Eli kept stealing glances and then staring at his oatmeal. The dog stayed under the table. I want to tell you I felt rebellion. I didn't. I don't know what to call it. Recognition, maybe. Like a horse who finally sees the bridle and understands the field he's been grazing in. Rebecca Stoltzfus was 19. She had her grandmother's hands. Wide knuckles, short nails, a small burn scar across the inside of her left wrist from a canning pot when she was 12. I had seen her at Sunday meetings since I was a boy. I had never once looked at her on purpose. That's the thing nobody outside understands. You can grow up beside a girl your whole life and never see her face until your father says her name in the kitchen on a Tuesday night. Then suddenly she's all you see. Her family kept the best yarrow garden in 3 districts. Her mother was known for stopping fevers. Her grandmother, Sadie Stoltzfus, 63 when she passed. No, 62. Dad always told me to get that right. Had been the closest thing our valley had to a broker who was a woman. Healers without the title. Hands that knew. The week between Dat's words and the visit to the Stoltzfus farm was the longest week of my young life. I went out to cut hay I didn't need to cut. I split wood until my palms cracked open, and Mam pressed comfrey leaf and raw honey into them without a word. She tied them with strips of an old flour sack. She didn't ask why I was tearing my hands apart in July. She knew. Mothers know. The whole house knew, and the whole house was quiet about it. And that quiet was its own kind of poultice. It drew the poison up slow. By Thursday, I could sit at the table again. By Saturday, I could pray. By Sunday, I was kneeling beside Dat in the buggy on the way to the Stoltzfus farm, and the wind was doing that thing it does in late August where it smells like cut clover and something burning far off. The Stoltzfus kitchen was bigger than ours. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the smell. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters in tight little bundles, each one tied with kitchen twine in a knot I recognized because Mam tied hers the same way. Yarrow, lobelia, boneset for the lung fevers. A brown glass bottle sat in the center of the table with no label, and I knew without asking it was a tincture, and I knew it was Sadie's recipe, and I knew Rebecca had made it herself. Aaron Stoltzfus poured coffee. His wife Miriam set out shoofly pie. Rebecca came in from the garden with dirt under her short nails and didn't quite meet my eyes. The kerosene lamp on the sideboard was hissing, that thin, steady hiss that sounds like a kettle that hasn't decided to boil yet. She sat across from me. Dat and Aaron started talking about the corn. Miriam asked Mam about the chamomile harvest. Nobody talked about us. That's how it's done. The two of you sit there while the world rearranges around your knees. I looked at Rebecca's hands on the table and thought about Hannah's hands on the steering wheel of the blue Ford, and I felt nothing. That was the part that scared me. I had expected grief. I had expected to be ripped in half. What I got instead was a quiet inside my chest that I hadn't earned. Rebecca finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of wet oak. She gave me the smallest nod. Not a smile, a nod. Like one farmer to another at the end of a long row. Aaron stood up. He took the brown bottle off the table. He poured 7 drops, I counted, 7, I'm sure of it, into a glass of water and pushed it across to me. For the road home, he said. That was all. I drank it. It tasted like bitter earth and something sweet underneath, and my throat warmed all the way down. Rebecca watched me drink it. Her mother watched her watch me. Dat watched everything and said nothing. That tincture was a yes. I didn't know it then. I learned later that in the old families, when a father offers the bride's tincture to a suitor and the suitor drinks, the thing is done. No paper, no ring, just 7 drops and a swallow. The buggy ride home was quiet. The horse knew the road. Dat finally cleared his throat about halfway back and said, "She's a good girl. Steady hands. Her grandmother's hands." That was the most he ever said about it. I looked out at the dark fields and tried to remember Hannah's laugh and couldn't. Not the sound of it, just the shape of her mouth when she did it. By the time we pulled into our lane, I couldn't remember that either. The land doesn't lie, and the land that night was telling me one chapter had closed without my permission, and another had opened the same way. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, because nobody tells a young man these things until he's old enough to bear them, was that Rebecca had been promised once before, not formally, quietly, to a boy named Mose Yoder who'd left the community at 19 and never came back. He went English. He drove a truck for a paving company down in Lancaster. She'd cried about him for a year, and her mother had given her boneset tea every night to bring the heat down out of her chest, and her grandmother Sadie had sat with her on the porch and said nothing for hours at a time. By the time Dad spoke to Aaron about me, Rebecca had been quiet for 2 summers. Healed, the families called it. Healed the way a bone heals. Strong at the break, but never the same shape. I didn't learn this from her. I learned it from Eli, my younger brother, 4 winters later, after he'd heard it from a cousin at a barn raising. He told me while we were stacking hay, not looking at me, the way men in our community tell each other the hardest things. He said, "You should know, so you understand why she is the way she is. And I want you to understand something. Aaron wasn't a hard man. I need you to say that with me. He just did what his father did. He saw his daughter heal from one English boy, and he chose her a plain one before another could come along. None of us knew different. That's the silence I'm talking about. Not cruelty. Just the old ways protecting themselves. the way a body grows scar tissue without asking permission. We were married in November. I won't pretend that first year was easy. It wasn't, and it shouldn't have been, and any man who tells you otherwise is lying or forgetting. Rebecca moved into the small house Dat and I had built on the back acre, and she brought her grandmother's herbs in 3 wooden crates, and she lined them up on the kitchen shelf in an order I didn't understand for months. Yarrow on the left, lobelia in the middle, boneset and mullein on the right. Comfrey in its own jar, set apart, because comfrey is for the outside of the body, and you don't mix it with the ones that go inside. That's what the old ones knew. I learned her shelf the way a man learns a new barn, slow, in the dark, with his hands. We had a system, Rebecca and me. She'd make tea every night before bed, chamomile most nights, but tulsi when my back was tight from the fields, and a thin green nettle tea in the spring when the pollen was bad. I'd bring in the wood. I'd check the lamp. We'd sit at the table and not say much. People think plain marriages are silent because there's nothing there. That's not it. The silence is the thing. The silence is where the marriage lives. Once, maybe a year in, I made a dry joke. I said, I thought modern medicine had all the answers. Turns out it didn't have most of them. Turns out my wife does. She didn't laugh. She just looked at me over her cup. But the corner of her mouth moved, and I carried that. Eli got married 2 years after I did, to a Byler girl from over the ridge, and at his wedding I sat on a bench beside 3 other young husbands, Jacob Miller, Amos Lapp, and a quiet fellow named Reuben whose last name I won't say. We were eating cold chicken off tin plates. Jacob said, "Lo, mine was chosen too." Amos nodded into his food. Reuben said, "7 drops?" Jacob said, "7 drops." Amos said, "Mine was 9. We didn't laugh. We didn't have to. 4 men at a wedding bench, all of us drinking the same bitter tincture from different brown bottles, all of us understanding for the first time that this thing had a shape, and the shape had a name, and the name had been passed down longer than any of our grandfathers had been alive. By the time I was 30, I'd stopped asking whether I'd chosen Rebecca. The question had worn itself smooth, like a creek stone. It was a book that finally named it for me. I was 34. I'd driven Rebecca into town in the hired van because her hip was bothering her, and the brochure had said it needed more than a poultice. While she was inside, I wandered into the little library on Main Street. I'd never been in one before, not really, and I picked up a book about folk medicine in Appalachia. I stood in the aisle and read about marriages arranged around healing knowledge, about families that traded daughters the way they traded seed, about brown bottles, about 7 drops. My hands started shaking, and I had to set the book down on the shelf and walk outside into the cold. I stood on the sidewalk and watched my breath come out white. A woman walked past me with a cell phone to her ear. I didn't move for a long time. What I felt wasn't anger. I want to say that clearly. The boy who drank the tincture at the Stoltzfus table. For the boy who counted 7 drops and didn't know what he was drinking. For him I felt grief. Soft, slow grief. The kind that doesn't leave bruises. Because nobody had told him. Because nobody had told Dat either, not in words. Because Aaron Stoltzfus was just doing what Sadie had taught him with her hands without ever saying it with her mouth. The land doesn't lie, and the land had been carrying this knowledge under everybody's feet for 200 years, and none of us had been given the words for it. We just drank and married and lived and healed each other in kitchens. I tried to tell an Englishman about it once, a contractor named Dave who was helping us put a metal roof on the dairy barn. He was kind. He asked about Rebecca over lunch. I tried to explain how we got married, the tincture, the 7 drops, the bottle on the table. He chewed his sandwich and looked at me like I'd told him I'd been sold. "Man," he said, "that's rough." That's all he said. And I understood, standing there with a roofing nail in my pocket and the sun on the back of my neck, that there are some things you can't carry across the fence line. Some things only make sense inside the field they grew in. I went home that night and Rebecca had made boneset tea because she'd seen the weather turning, and I drank it without saying anything, and she put her hand on the back of my neck for 1 second as she passed behind my chair. And that was a whole conversation. Here is what the plain life gave me, and what I still carry. The smell of cut hay in July, the way it rises up off the field after the second pass of the mower, sweet and green and almost too much. The sound of my father's hand plane on white oak in the wood shop on a Saturday afternoon, That long, slow shh. That means a man is paying attention to what's in front of him. And the taste of cold spring water from the pump behind Mam's kitchen, the one Grossdaddy dug by hand in 1958. Water so cold it hurts your teeth and tastes like iron and stone and 40 years of patience. Those three things are with me when I close my eyes. They are with me when Rebecca pours the tea. They are with me when I walk the back fence at dusk, and the deer come out of the tree line and don't run. I'll say it the way I've come to believe it. Wisdom dressed in plain clothes. That's what we have. Not better, not worse, just plain. Tradition and truth can sit at the same table, and they often do. And sometimes the truth is that your father chose your wife before you knew her name, and the tradition is that he wasn't wrong to do it. And both of those things are true at the same time, and you have to learn to hold them. I'm building something now, with Rebecca, that I didn't know how to build at 20. 6 children, a herb shelf longer than her grandmother's. A son who already knows the difference between comfrey and lobelia, who is 12, and who will one day sit at somebody's kitchen table and drink 7 drops from a brown bottle, and I will say nothing, because there is nothing to say that the bottle doesn't say better. If you grew up somewhere your grandfather's hands knew more than the doctor's, I see you. If you grew up in a house where the biggest decisions of your life were made by other people in low voices at a kitchen table, and you weren't asked, and you didn't think to ask, I see you. You carry something old, and that is enough. You don't have to translate it for the people who don't speak it. You don't have to apologize for the shape your love took when it was handed to you already arranged. There's no shame in being chosen. There's no shame in choosing back, slowly, over years. And if you're still inside the community, sitting at your own table tonight, I see you. If you left, and you can't quite say why, and you can't quite go back, I see you. If you're English, but something in you keeps pulling toward the old ways, toward a grandmother you barely remember who knew which leaf stopped a cough, I see you. If your grandfather knew a remedy he never wrote down, and he's gone now, and the recipe went with him, I see you, and I'm sorry, and you're not alone. If you lost someone modern medicine couldn't save, and you've wondered ever since whether the old ways might have, I see you most of all. Wherever you are in this, I see you, and you are not alone. Tell me in the comments, was there a remedy in your family that nobody wrote down? A jar on a shelf, a bottle in a cupboard, a tea your grandmother made that you can almost taste but not quite name? I want to hear it. There is so much more I haven't said yet. There are remedies I haven't been ready to share, the ones for the bleeding that wouldn't stop, the ones the Brocksher used with his hands, the ones we didn't tell the bishop about, but I'm getting closer. If you want to walk this road with me, subscribe to Dodd. That's how these old ways stay alive. And a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these stories are worth remembering, and that keeps the lamp lit. You were chosen too, you just didn't know by what.